The strangest love story in this city began with a man who had nothing left, giving away the only warm thing he owned on the coldest night of the year. The wind cut through downtown Chicago like a blade that evening, the kind of wind that made the streetlights tremble and turned every breath into a cloud of white fog. Snow drifted across the sidewalks in thin, restless waves while traffic crawled through slush along Michigan Avenue. Most people hurried with their heads down, coats wrapped tight, trying to outrun the bitter air. Ethan Carter was not one of those people. At 34 years old, he walked slowly along the sidewalk, hands deep in the pockets of a worn brown jacket that had already seen too many winters. The fabric was thin now, the lining torn near the cuffs, but it was still the warmest thing he owned. Ethan had spent the day searching for work that never came. Construction companies had shut down projects all across the city after the last economic crash, and the phone calls he once relied on had stopped months ago. Now he picked up small temporary labor when he could find it, enough for food and gasoline, rarely enough for anything more. The old pickup truck he parked behind a warehouse had quietly become his bedroom. Still, there was something about Ethan that the cold had never managed to freeze. Maybe it was the way he kept moving even when the world pushed him down. Maybe it was the quiet kindness that survived inside him like a small, steady flame. As he passed a nearly empty bus stop near the corner of Dearborn Street, he noticed someone standing beneath the flickering yellow light. A woman. She wore a business skirt and high heels that were completely wrong for a night like this. Snow clung to her dark hair, and her arms were wrapped tightly around her body as she shivered uncontrollably. Her coat was missing. Her fingers had turned pale from the cold. Ethan slowed his steps. Most people would have kept walking. In this city, strangers rarely stopped for each other anymore. But he could see the tremor in her shoulders, the way the wind sliced through the thin fabric of her blouse. For a moment he hesitated, knowing what it would mean. Then he stepped forward and shrugged off his jacket. The cold struck him immediately like icy water. The woman looked up, startled, her blue eyes wide with confusion. Ethan gently placed the jacket around her shoulders. The warmth seemed to shock her even more than the gesture itself. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with the wind. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "Because someone should." For a few seconds, they stood there under the streetlight, while snow drifted around them like silent confetti. She pulled the jacket tighter around herself and studied his face as if trying to understand something deeper than the moment itself. "My name is Olivia," she said softly. "Ethan Carter," he replied. "Nice to meet you." The distant rumble of an approaching bus echoed down the street. Olivia looked toward the sound, and then back at Ethan again, as though memorizing him. The bus arrived in a cloud of steam and squealing brakes. She stepped onto the first stair, paused, and glanced back once more. "Thank you, Ethan." Then the doors closed, and the bus disappeared into the snowy night. Ethan stood alone again beneath the streetlight, now shivering in the brutal wind. He rubbed his hands together and laughed quietly to himself. "Well, that was probably the stupidest thing you could have done tonight," he murmured. He had no idea that the woman wearing his jacket was one of the most powerful chief executive officers in the entire city. And he definitely had no idea that she was about to change his life forever. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Now the night grew even colder as Ethan began the long walk back toward the industrial district where his truck waited behind an abandoned warehouse. Snow crunched beneath his boots while the wind bit sharply through his thin shirt. Without the jacket, the temperature felt 10 degrees colder, but strangely he did not regret what he had done. Somewhere across the city, Olivia Bennett sat near the window of the moving bus, still wrapped inside the warm brown jacket of a stranger who had given away the last piece of comfort he owned. She lifted the collar closer to her face and inhaled the faint scent of laundry soap and winter air. Outside the glass towers of downtown, Chicago glittered against the stormy sky. Inside her mind, a single question repeated again and again. Who was that man who gave away everything without asking for anything in return? Olivia Bennett was used to power, wealth, and people who wanted something from her. But tonight she had just met someone very different. And by the time the snowstorm ended, she would decide that she needed to see Ethan Carter again. The snowstorm continued long after the bus carrying Olivia disappeared into the glowing streets of downtown Chicago, and Ethan Carter walked nearly 2 miles through the frozen wind, before he finally reached the industrial district near the Chicago River, where his old pickup truck waited behind a silent warehouse. The metal door of the warehouse rattled softly in the wind, and a thin layer of snow covered the cracked pavement around the truck. Ethan brushed the snow off the driver's side door and climbed inside, pulling it shut quickly to block the freezing air. The truck smelled faintly of gasoline, old leather, and the instant coffee he drank most mornings. A pile of folded blankets rested across the back seat beside a small plastic container that held everything important he still owned. Ethan leaned back against the seat and exhaled slowly, watching his breath drift through the dim interior. Without the jacket, the cold crept through his shirt almost immediately, and he rubbed his arms together to warm himself. After a moment, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small tin box that had once held mints. The metal lid opened with a quiet click. Inside the box were only three things: a photograph, a folded drawing made with blue crayon, and a thin silver ring. Ethan picked up the photograph first. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside a smiling woman with bright eyes and dark hair. Between them stood a little boy with messy blonde hair and a grin that looked far too big for his small face. The boy held a toy truck above his head as if he had just won a championship. Ethan traced his finger across the picture and smiled gently. "Good night, buddy," he whispered softly into the quiet truck. The drawing beneath the photograph showed a simple house, a sun in the corner of the page, and two stick figures holding hands beside a larger figure, wearing what looked like a construction helmet. Written across the top in uneven letters were the words, "I love you, Daddy." Ethan closed the tin box carefully and placed it back inside the glove compartment. The past was something he carried with him everywhere, even when he tried not to think about it. Once he had been Ethan Carter, structural engineer for a respected construction firm that built schools and hospitals across Illinois. Once he had owned a small house in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. Once his son Noah had run through that house every morning before school, while his wife Megan laughed in the kitchen. But life had changed quickly after Megan became sick. Medical bills had swallowed their savings, and Ethan had left his job to care for her during the final year of her illness. By the time she passed away, the house was gone, the savings were gone, and the company he once worked for had collapsed during the economic downturn that followed. Ethan had done everything he could to protect his son from the chaos, even agreeing when a social worker arranged for Noah to live temporarily with Megan's parents in Wisconsin until Ethan could rebuild a stable life. That had been nearly a year ago. Since then, Ethan had promised himself that he would get back on his feet no matter how long it took. Tonight, though, his thoughts kept drifting back to the bus stop and the woman named Olivia. He remembered the way she had looked at him beneath the streetlight, surprised not only by the jacket, but by the idea that someone would help without asking for anything in return. Ethan chuckled quietly and shook his head. She was probably home now in a warm apartment somewhere on the north side of the city, surrounded by people who belonged to her world. A world that looked nothing like the inside of a freezing pickup truck. Outside, the snow fell harder, tapping gently against the windshield as the storm thickened over Chicago. Ethan wrapped one of the blankets around his shoulders and leaned his head against the cold glass of the window. Tomorrow he would wake early, shave in the public restroom at the gas station down the street, and spend another day searching for work. He closed his eyes slowly as exhaustion pulled him toward sleep. What he did not know was that at that same moment, several miles away, Olivia Bennett sat inside a sleek black sedan, pulling into the underground garage of a towering glass building that bore her last name across the entrance in bright silver letters. The driver stepped out quickly and opened her door, while security cameras watched every corner of the polished concrete garage. Olivia stepped out of the car, still wearing the worn brown jacket Ethan had given her. The driver hesitated for a moment, clearly confused by the old coat that did not belong among the expensive suits and dresses Olivia usually wore. But Olivia said nothing. She simply wrapped the jacket tighter around herself as she walked toward the private elevator that would carry her to the top floor office of Bennett Group. In a city filled with wealth, power, and endless ambition, one small act of kindness had quietly crossed the path of a man who had lost almost everything and a woman who seemed to have it all. Neither of them understood yet that the night at the bus stop had only been the beginning. Morning arrived slowly over Chicago as pale winter sunlight reflected across the glass towers of the financial district. High above Michigan Avenue, The top floor of Bennett Group headquarters buzzed quietly with controlled energy. Assistants moved through the marble lobby with tablets in their hands. Security guards stood near the elevators, and the entire floor carried the sharp, polished scent of expensive coffee and fresh paper. At the center of it all was Olivia Bennett. At 31 years old, she was already known across the city as one of the most powerful chief executive officers in the technology and logistics industry. Her company managed shipping software used by corporations across the United States of America, and the building that carried her family name was considered one of the most influential business headquarters in the Midwest. Yet as Olivia stepped out of the private elevator that morning, something about her looked slightly different. Draped over her elegant dark coat was the worn brown jacket Ethan Carter had given her the night before. Her assistant Daniel noticed it immediately, but wisely said nothing. Olivia walked directly into the conference room where a dozen executives already waited around a long polished table that overlooked the Chicago skyline. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," Daniel said quietly, as he handed her a digital tablet containing the agenda for the morning board meeting. Olivia nodded and took her seat at the head of the table. Charts filled the large screen at the front of the room as one of the senior directors began presenting quarterly financial numbers. Revenue growth, international expansion, and new software contracts were discussed in precise detail. Olivia listened carefully, asking sharp questions when necessary, her voice calm and controlled. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like the confident leader the city had come to admire. But inside her thoughts drifted repeatedly back to the snowy bus stop from the night before. She could still remember the cold wind, the quiet streetlight, and the moment a complete stranger had placed his only jacket around her shoulders without hesitation. The idea seemed almost impossible in the world she lived in now. Most people who approached Olivia Bennett wanted something. Investors wanted influence. Competitors wanted advantage. Even distant relatives suddenly remembered her name when they needed financial help. But Ethan Carter had wanted nothing at all. He had simply helped her and walked away into the snow. Olivia adjusted the sleeves of the jacket slightly as the meeting continued. Beneath the table, her fingers brushed the worn fabric as if confirming the moment had truly happened. When the presentation finally ended, one of the board members cleared his throat and leaned forward. His name was Richard Callahan, a wealthy investor who had recently purchased a large share of Bennett Group stock. "Miss Bennett, there is one more matter we must discuss before the afternoon strategy meeting," he said in a tone that sounded polite but carried hidden pressure. Olivia looked up calmly. "Go ahead, Richard." Callahan folded his hands together on the table. Several members of the board believed the company would benefit from a stronger partnership with Callahan Global Logistics. A personal alliance between our families would send a powerful message of stability to investors. Olivia understood immediately what he meant. Callahan was not talking about a business contract. He was talking about marriage. Over the past year, several influential figures in the financial world had suggested similar arrangements. For wealthy families like their strategic marriages were often treated like business deals. Olivia leaned back in her chair slowly. "I believe Bennett Group is performing quite well without arranging my personal life as part of the company strategy," she replied calmly. Callahan smiled in a way that did not quite reach his eyes. "Of course, Miss Bennett, but public perception matters. Investors prefer leadership that appears settled and stable." The implication hung heavily in the room. Olivia knew exactly how rumors could move stock prices in a single afternoon. For a moment, she considered simply dismissing the conversation and moving on. But then a strange thought crossed her mind. She remembered Ethan standing under the streetlight, smiling gently even as the freezing wind struck his face. Without fully planning the words, Olivia looked across the table and spoke. "I appreciate the concern, Richard, but there is no need to worry about my personal life." The room grew quiet as several executives exchanged curious glances. Olivia continued calmly. "I am already seeing someone." The words surprised even her as they left her mouth. Richard Callahan blinked in confusion. "Someone serious?" he asked carefully. Olivia paused for only a second before answering. "Yes," she said firmly. "Very serious." And in that moment, the simple lie spoken inside a glass tower high above Chicago quietly set the next chapter of Ethan Carter's life into motion. The quiet confidence Olivia Bennett had shown in the boardroom lasted exactly until the conference room door closed behind her. The moment she stepped into the private hallway outside the executive offices, She slowed her pace and exhaled slowly, realizing the weight of the words she had just spoken. I am already seeing someone. The sentence echoed in her mind as she walked toward her office overlooking Lake Michigan. Inside the office, the walls of glass revealed the entire winter skyline of Chicago. Gray clouds drifted above the frozen lake, while distant traffic moved like tiny lines of light along the highways. Olivia placed her tablet on the desk and remained standing for a moment, still wearing Ethan Carter jacket over her shoulders. The worn fabric looked completely out of place in a room filled with polished wood furniture and modern art worth more than most houses. Her assistant Daniel knocked gently before entering. Miss Bennett, the communications team has already requested clarification about your statement in the meeting. Word travels quickly among investors, he said carefully. Olivia nodded, already expecting that reaction. Rumors moved through the financial world faster than any official announcement. If even one board member repeated what she had said, reporters would soon begin asking questions. Daniel continued speaking with cautious professionalism. Several investors are likely to ask about this relationship. If it appears unstable, it could invite unnecessary speculation about leadership stability. Olivia walked slowly toward the window, her arms folded as she stared out across the snowy city. I understand, Daniel, she replied quietly. Then she added something that surprised even herself. That is why we are going to make sure it appears very real. Daniel blinked in confusion. I am sorry, Miss Bennett, I do not believe I understand. Olivia turned slightly toward him. Do you remember the man I mentioned earlier this morning? The one who helped me during the storm last night? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, Miss Bennett, the one who gave you the jacket. Exactly, Olivia said. I want you to find him. Daniel looked genuinely surprised for the first time since he had started working for her. You want our security team to locate a stranger in the city based only on a name. Olivia smiled faintly. His name is Ethan Carter, and he mentioned that he works temporary construction jobs around the industrial district near the Chicago River. Start there. Daniel hesitated only briefly before nodding. Understood, Miss Bennett. I will assign a private investigator immediately. As Daniel left the office, Olivia removed the jacket and held it carefully in her hands. The lining was thin and worn, but it still carried the faint scent of winter air and laundry soap. For reasons she could not fully explain, the memory of that quiet man standing under the streetlight had stayed with her all morning. Most people in her world tried to impress her with expensive gifts or clever business proposals. Ethan Carter had simply given away the only warm thing he owned. Hours later, the afternoon sun dipped lower behind the skyline as Daniel returned with a folder in his hand. Our team located him faster than expected, he explained. Ethan Carter currently works day labor shifts at a small renovation site on Halsted Street. When he is not working, he sleeps in a pickup truck behind a warehouse nearby. Olivia listened without speaking, though the information clearly affected her more than she expected. Daniel placed the folder on her desk. There is more, Miss Bennett. According to the investigator, Ethan previously worked as a structural engineer before his company closed. Medical bills following his wife's illness forced him to sell his home. His young son now lives with grandparents in Wisconsin until Mr. Carter is able to regain stable employment. Olivia looked down at the folder quietly. The image of Ethan smiling beneath the freezing streetlight returned to her mind. He had never mentioned any of that. He had simply helped her and walked away. Daniel studied her expression carefully. Miss Bennett, may I ask what role this man will play in the situation you described earlier to the board? Olivia closed the folder gently and looked back toward the winter skyline. If the board believes I already have someone in my life, then we are going to give them exactly what they expect, she said calmly. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. And Ethan Carter is aware of this plan. Olivia shook her head slowly. Not yet. She picked up the worn brown jacket once more and draped it across the back of her chair. Arrange a meeting, Daniel, she said with quiet determination. Because I have a feeling Ethan Carter is about to receive the most unusual offer of his life. The following morning, the sky above Chicago was pale gray, and the cold air carried the quiet metallic smell that always followed a heavy snowstorm. On Halsted Street, the city felt very different from the polished glass towers downtown. Old brick warehouses lined the road, their loading docks covered with dirty snow and frozen tire tracks. Construction crews had already begun working despite the temperature. The sound of hammers echoed through the narrow streets while trucks idled nearby with thick clouds of exhaust rising into the cold air. Ethan Carter stood near the entrance of a partially renovated building wearing a borrowed hard hat and thick work gloves that were too large for his hands. The temporary job paid barely enough to cover gasoline and cheap food, but he never complained. Work was work, and every dollar moved him one step closer to the promise he had made to his son. Ethan lifted a stack of wooden boards and carried them across the icy ground toward a group of workers inside the building. His breath rose in white clouds as he moved back and forth between the supply truck and the work site. The cold had become something he barely noticed anymore. During a short break, he leaned against the side of the building and rubbed his hands together for warmth. One of the older workers beside him took a sip of coffee from a metal thermos and looked at Ethan curiously. "You look like you froze half to death last night, friend," the man said. Ethan chuckled quietly. "Something like that." The man nodded toward Ethan's thin shirt. "Where is your coat anyway?" Ethan paused for a moment before answering. "I gave it to someone who needed it more." The older worker raised his eyebrows in mild disbelief, but said nothing else. A few minutes later, the foreman called everyone back to work, and the sound of tools filled the building once again. Across the street, however, something unusual had appeared among the rusted pickup trucks and construction vans. A long black sedan slowly pulled to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the gray sky above. The vehicle looked completely out of place in the rough, industrial neighborhood. Several workers noticed it immediately and exchanged puzzled glances. The rear door opened, and a tall man wearing a dark overcoat stepped out. His shoes sank slightly into the slushy snow as he looked around the work site with calm attention. The man approached the foreman and spoke quietly for a moment before pointing toward Ethan Carter. The foreman turned and waved his hand. "Carter, someone is here asking for you." Ethan looked up in confusion and walked toward the sidewalk. As he approached the stranger, the man gave a polite nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. My name is Daniel Brooks. I work for Miss Olivia Bennett." Ethan blinked in surprise. The name instantly carried him back to the snowy bus stop and the woman standing beneath the flickering streetlight wearing his jacket. For a moment he wondered if this was some strange coincidence. Daniel continued speaking in a calm, professional voice. "Miss Bennett asked me to find you and deliver a message. She would like to meet with you today if possible." Ethan wiped dust from his gloves and frowned slightly. "Meet me? Why?" Daniel opened the back door of the sedan and revealed the worn brown jacket folded neatly across the seat. "She wanted to return something that belongs to you," he said. Ethan stared at the jacket for a moment before looking back at the man. "You came all the way here just to give me my coat back?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Not exactly. Miss Bennett believes she owes you a proper thank you, and she would prefer to say it in person." Ethan hesitated as the cold wind moved through the construction site. Part of him felt that stepping into that black sedan would be like crossing into a world that had nothing to do with his life anymore. Yet another part of him remembered the quiet gratitude in Olivia's eyes the night before. He glanced back toward the unfinished building where the other workers continued carrying lumber and tools through the open doorway. Then he looked again at the jacket resting on the seat of the sedan. Daniel waited patiently beside the open door. "Mr. Carter, Miss Bennett office is about 15 minutes from here." Ethan took a slow breath and nodded. "All right," he said finally. "I guess I can spare a few minutes." What Ethan Carter did not realize as he stepped toward the waiting car was that this short meeting would soon place him in the center of a plan that neither wealth nor power could fully control. The black sedan moved smoothly through the crowded streets of Chicago while Ethan Carter sat quietly in the back seat, still wearing his dusty work boots and construction jacket. The interior of the car felt warmer than any place he had been in weeks. Soft leather seats surrounded him, and the quiet hum of the engine almost erased the sounds of traffic outside. Ethan glanced through the window as the neighborhoods slowly changed. The old brick warehouses and chain-link fences of the industrial district faded behind them. Soon the streets became wider and cleaner. Glass office towers rose toward the gray winter sky, and people in business suits hurried along the sidewalks carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, suddenly aware that he did not belong in this world. Daniel Brooks sat across from him with calm professional posture. For several minutes neither man spoke. Finally Ethan cleared his throat. "So this Olivia Bennett works around here somewhere?" he asked. Daniel gave a small polite smile. "Miss Bennett office is at the top of the Bennett Group headquarters building on Michigan Avenue." Ethan nodded slowly as he looked out the window again. He had heard that name before. Almost everyone in Chicago had. Bennett Group was one of the most powerful companies in the city. The idea that the woman from the bus stop could be connected to a place like that seemed almost ridiculous. A few minutes later, the sedan turned into a wide circular driveway in front of a tall glass building that seemed to reflect the entire city skyline. The words Bennett Group were displayed across the entrance in polished silver letters nearly 3 feet tall. Ethan felt his stomach tighten slightly as the car came to a stop. A uniformed doorman stepped forward and opened the door. The warm air inside the building carried the quiet scent of polished marble and fresh coffee. Ethan followed Daniel through the lobby, where security guards and receptionists glanced at him with curious expressions. His worn boots left faint traces of melting snow across the shining floor. Daniel led him toward a private elevator that opened with a soft chime. Inside the elevator, the walls were made of dark glass that reflected Ethan's own uneasy expression. The elevator rose quickly and silently. After a few moments, the doors opened into a quiet hallway lined with modern artwork and soft lighting. Daniel gestured toward a pair of tall wooden doors at the end of the corridor. "Miss Bennett is waiting for you inside," he said. Ethan hesitated briefly before walking forward and pushing the door open. The office beyond was larger than most apartments he had seen in his life. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the frozen blue surface of Lake Michigan stretching far into the distance. In the center of the room, Olivia Bennett stood beside a long desk made of dark walnut wood. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, and her dark hair was pulled neatly over one shoulder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The memory of the snowy bus stop hung quietly between them. Then Olivia smiled gently. "Hello, Ethan," she said. "I was hoping you would come." Ethan scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Your assistant seemed pretty determined to find me." Olivia stepped closer and lifted the brown jacket from the back of her chair. "I believe this belongs to you," she said. She held it out to him, but Ethan shook his head. "You should keep it if you are still cold," he replied with a small smile. Olivia looked down at the jacket and laughed softly. "I have not been cold since that night." Ethan accepted the coat and folded it over his arm. "So you brought me here just to return my jacket?" he asked. Olivia took a slow breath before answering. "Not exactly. There is something else I wanted to ask you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." Olivia walked toward the window and looked out over the city for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she turned back to face him. "Ethan, what I am about to ask may sound very strange, but I promise I will explain everything." Ethan crossed his arms and leaned against the edge of the desk. "After the week I have had, strange might actually be interesting," he said. Olivia nodded slightly and spoke the words that would change everything. "I need you to pretend to be my boyfriend." For a few seconds the office fell completely silent after Olivia Bennett spoke those words. Ethan Carter stared at her as if he had misheard something. The city skyline stretched behind her through the enormous windows, but his attention was locked on the calm expression on her face. "Pretend to be your boyfriend," he repeated slowly. Olivia nodded once, clearly aware of how strange it sounded. "I told several members of my company board that I am already in a serious relationship. Now they expect to meet the person I was talking about." Ethan let out a short laugh that carried more disbelief than humor. "And somehow you decided that person should be me." Olivia folded her hands in front of her and took a breath. "The situation is more complicated than it sounds. One of the investors on the board has been pressuring me to enter a personal alliance with his family. He believes a marriage between powerful companies would increase investor confidence." Ethan leaned back against the desk and shook his head slowly. "So this is some kind of corporate matchmaking situation." "Something like that," Olivia admitted. "When the pressure became too obvious, I told them I was already seeing someone." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And the first person who came to mind was the guy who gave you a coat at a bus stop." Olivia smiled faintly. "The truth is, you are the only person I know right now who helped me without expecting anything in return. That matters more than you probably realize." Ethan crossed his arms and looked around the enormous office again. Everything in the room spoke of wealth and influence. Expensive artwork hung on the walls, and the polished desk in front of him probably cost more than his old pickup truck. Finally, he looked back at Olivia. "You do realize this is a ridiculous idea?" Olivia did not disagree. "It may be unusual, but it is also temporary. I only need someone to appear beside me at a few public events. Dinners. A charity gala next month. A couple of meetings where investors will expect to see that my life is stable and settled." Ethan rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. You want me to walk into a room full of billionaires and pretend that I belong there? Olivia stepped closer and spoke calmly. I want you to help me solve a problem. And in return, I will help you solve one of yours. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of help are we talking about? Olivia gestured toward a chair beside the desk. Please sit. This conversation deserves more than standing in the middle of the room. Ethan sat slowly while Olivia opened the folder Daniel had brought earlier that day. She turned it so he could see the documents inside. I know about your engineering background, Ethan. I know your company closed, and that medical bills forced you to sell your house. I also know your son is currently living with his grandparents while you try to rebuild your life. Ethan stiffened slightly at the sudden exposure of his private struggles. How did you find all that out? He asked quietly. Olivia answered honestly. I asked my assistant to learn more about you before I made this request. Ethan looked down at the papers for a moment before lifting his eyes again. And you think pretending to date a corporate executive is going to fix my life? Olivia shook her head gently. Not fix it, but it could help. Bennett Group is expanding into infrastructure development this year. Your experience as a structural engineer would be valuable. If you agree to help me, I can offer you a legitimate position in our engineering department. A real salary. Stability. Ethan sat very still as the weight of the offer settled around him. Outside the tall windows, the winter wind continued to move across Lake Michigan. Finally, he spoke again. You are serious about this? Completely serious, Olivia replied. Ethan leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment before looking at her again with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You want a guy who sleeps in a pickup truck to walk into high society pretending to be your boyfriend while you tell your investors everything is perfectly normal. Olivia smiled gently. Yes, she said. That is exactly what I am asking. The silence in Olivia Bennett's office stretched for several seconds after Ethan Carter repeated her proposal in his own words. Outside the massive glass windows, the gray winter sky hung low above Lake Michigan, while distant waves rolled slowly against the frozen shoreline. Ethan leaned forward in the chair and rubbed his hands together as if trying to warm them, though the room itself was comfortably heated. The truth was that he was not cold. He was thinking. Finally, he looked up at Olivia again. You realize people like me do not usually walk into buildings like this unless we are carrying a toolbox, he said quietly. Olivia rested her hands on the edge of the desk and studied him with calm attention. People like you built half the buildings in this city, she replied. There is no reason you should feel like you do not belong here. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. That sounds nice, but the world does not always work that way. Olivia nodded slowly. I know that. That is exactly why I am asking you. Ethan glanced down at the folder of papers again and then back at her. Suppose I say yes. What exactly happens next? Olivia walked around the desk and sat in the chair across from him so that they were now facing each other at the same level. If you agree, we will begin slowly, she explained. First, you will come to a small dinner with several board members next week. After that, there will be a charity event that Bennett Group hosts every winter. At that event, you and I will appear together as a couple. Ethan listened carefully while she spoke. And the story is that we just met recently, he asked. Olivia nodded. We will keep the story simple. We met by chance in the city and discovered that we enjoyed each other's company. Ethan laughed softly. That part might actually be true. Olivia smiled in return, but then her expression grew serious again. Ethan, I want to be very clear about something. This arrangement will never require you to lie about who you are. Your background as an engineer is real. Your work experience is real. The only thing that will be different is the nature of our relationship. Ethan considered her words. He appreciated that she was not asking him to pretend to be someone completely different. Still, the idea of stepping into her world felt overwhelming. He leaned back and crossed his arms again. You mentioned a job earlier, he said carefully. Olivia nodded. Yes. Our company is beginning several infrastructure projects this year. Bridges, transit centers, and shipping facilities. I spoke with our engineering director this morning, and he confirmed that someone with your structural experience would be extremely valuable. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. You talked to your engineering department about me already. Olivia shrugged lightly. I prefer to plan ahead. Ethan stood up and slowly walked toward the window. From this height, the city looked completely different than it did from the streets. Cars moved like tiny dots through the snow, and the river cut a dark line through the buildings. For a moment, he imagined what it would feel like to return to the profession he had loved before life had collapsed around him. He thought about the promise he had made to his son Noah. One day I will bring you home again. Behind him, Olivia waited quietly without trying to pressure him. After nearly a minute, Ethan finally turned around. If I do this, he said slowly, there are two conditions. Olivia straightened slightly. I am listening. First, Ethan continued, this has to remain honest. I am not going to pretend to be some rich executive. I will be exactly who I am. Olivia nodded immediately. That is exactly what I want. Ethan took a breath before stating the second condition. And when this arrangement ends, you will not treat me like some charity project. If I work for your company, it will be because I earned the job. Olivia stood up and walked toward him with a confident smile. Ethan Carter, I would not have asked for your help if I did not already believe you earned it. She extended her hand. So do we have an agreement? Ethan looked at her hand for a moment and then shook it firmly. All right, he said with a quiet laugh. I guess I am your boyfriend now. The first time Ethan Carter walked back into Bennett Group headquarters as Olivia Bennett boyfriend, he felt as if the entire building could somehow see through him. 2 days had passed since their unusual agreement, and Chicago had finally begun to recover from the heavy winter storm. Sunlight reflected off the frozen sidewalks while the air remained sharp and cold. A black sedan arrived once again at the entrance of the tall glass building, and Ethan stepped out wearing a dark navy suit that Olivia's assistant had arranged earlier that morning. The fabric still felt unfamiliar against his shoulders. For nearly a year, his daily clothing had been work boots and worn jackets. Now the polished marble entrance of one of the most powerful companies in the city stretched in front of him. Olivia stood beside him as the doorman opened the glass doors. She looked confident, as always, in a deep green winter coat that matched the calm strength in her posture. Ethan noticed that people inside the lobby immediately recognized her presence. Security guards nodded respectfully, and employees stepped aside as she walked through the building. You look like you belong here already, Olivia said quietly as they crossed the marble floor together. Ethan gave a small, amused smile. That makes one of us. Olivia glanced at him and shook her head slightly. Remember what you told me 2 days ago. You are not pretending to be someone else. You are exactly who you are. Ethan nodded, but the feeling of stepping into a different world still lingered in his mind. The elevator carried them toward the executive level once again, but this time the destination was not Olivia's private office. Instead, Daniel Brooks was waiting outside a large dining room that overlooked the Chicago River. The evening sun reflected across the frozen water as lights from nearby buildings began to glow in the early winter dusk. Daniel greeted them with a professional smile. Everything is ready, Miss Bennett. Several members of the board have already arrived. Ethan took a slow breath as Olivia gently placed her hand on his arm. Ready? She asked quietly. Ethan exhaled and nodded. As ready as I will ever be. The doors opened and the sound of conversation drifted into the hallway. Inside the dining room, a long polished table was surrounded by several executives and investors dressed in formal business attire. When Olivia and Ethan entered the room, the conversations paused almost immediately. Richard Callahan sat near the center of the table with a glass of wine in his hand. His sharp eyes studied Ethan carefully as Olivia approached. Good evening, everyone, Olivia said with calm confidence. I would like you all to meet someone important to me. She turned slightly and looked at Ethan with a warm expression that felt surprisingly genuine. This is Ethan Carter, the man I mentioned earlier this week. Ethan extended his hand politely as the investors greeted him one by one. Some appeared curious. Others seemed quietly skeptical. Richard Callahan stood last and shook Ethan's hand with measured strength. Mr. Carter, he said slowly, I understand you and Miss Bennett met recently. Ethan remembered Olivia's advice to keep the story simple and honest. Yes, sir, we met during the storm earlier this week, he replied calmly. Richard raised an eyebrow. The storm? That sounds like an interesting introduction. Olivia smiled faintly. Ethan helped me when my car became stranded near a bus stop. I suppose you could say the weather was responsible for our meeting. Several people around the table chuckled politely, but Richard continued studying Ethan with quiet calculation. And what exactly do you do, Mr. Carter, he asked. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. I am a structural engineer. I recently joined the infrastructure development division here at Bennett Group. A few executives exchanged impressed looks while Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. Well, Mr. Carter, he said with a thin smile. It seems the storm brought more than snow to this city. For the rest of the evening, the dinner continued with discussions about new construction projects and shipping routes across the Midwest. Ethan listened carefully and occasionally added thoughtful comments based on his engineering experience. Slowly the tension in the room softened as several investors began to see that he was not simply standing beside Olivia as decoration. Yet across the table Richard Callahan continued watching him quietly, as if measuring something invisible. Ethan could not know it yet, but the man already suspected that the story behind Olivia's new relationship was far more complicated than anyone in that room realized. The days following the dinner passed quickly, but the quiet tension that had settled in the room that night did not disappear. Ethan Carter began spending most of his time inside Bennett Group headquarters working with the infrastructure development team that Olivia Bennett had mentioned earlier. The engineering department occupied several floors of the building where large digital models of bridges and shipping terminals covered the walls. For the first time in nearly a year, Ethan felt something that had been missing from his life: purpose. Each morning he reviewed design plans with the team and discussed load calculations for upcoming construction projects across Illinois and neighboring states. The work came naturally to him, and within a few days several engineers began treating him like a colleague rather than the mysterious man who had suddenly appeared beside the company chief executive officer. Yet while Ethan slowly found his place inside the company, rumors moved quietly through the building like a winter draft slipping through cracks in a door. Employees whispered about how the chief executive officer had suddenly introduced a boyfriend no one had ever heard about before. Some people believed the story without question, while others watched carefully, wondering if there was more behind the sudden relationship. Among those watching most closely was Richard Callahan. Late one afternoon, Ethan left the engineering office carrying a set of design notes when Daniel Brooks approached him near the elevator. "Mr. Carter," Daniel said calmly, "Miss Bennett asked me to inform you that the charity gala next week will require additional preparation. Several members of the board are planning to attend, and the media will likely be present as well." Ethan nodded slowly. "I figured something like that was coming." Daniel studied him for a moment. "You handled the dinner meeting better than most people would have." Some of the investors seemed genuinely impressed. Ethan smiled faintly. "I just talked about bridges and steel loads. That part of my life never changed." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside together. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Ethan noticed two men standing near the entrance speaking quietly with a security guard. When the doors opened, one of the men turned, and his eyes met Ethan with immediate recognition. Richard Callahan stepped forward with the same measured confidence he had shown at the dinner table days earlier. "Mr. Carter," he said pleasantly, "I was hoping we might speak for a moment." Ethan glanced at Daniel, who gave a subtle nod before stepping aside. Richard gestured toward a quiet corner of the lobby away from the reception desk. "I understand you joined our engineering department very quickly," he began. Ethan folded his arms calmly. "I was offered an opportunity, and I accepted it." Richard smiled slightly, though his expression remained calculating. Opportunities rarely appear overnight in companies of this size, especially for individuals who were unknown to the board just a few days earlier. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Sometimes storms change more than the weather," he replied quietly. Richard chuckled softly at the answer. "Perhaps they do. But I have spent many years working with powerful organizations, and I have learned that coincidences are often more complicated than they appear." He paused and leaned slightly closer. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, how exactly does a structural engineer sleeping in a pickup truck become the boyfriend of one of the most influential women in the city?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan considered his response carefully before speaking. "The truth is simpler than you think," he said calmly. "A few nights ago, Olivia Bennett was standing alone in the cold, and I gave her my jacket." Richard studied his face for several seconds as if trying to detect whether the explanation was sincere or cleverly constructed. Finally, he straightened his coat and smiled again, though the expression did not fully reach his eyes. "Well, Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "I suppose even the coldest storms can create unusual connections." He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Ethan standing quietly in the lobby. Across the room, Daniel watched the exchange with growing concern. Because what Richard Callahan had not said aloud was the most dangerous thought forming in his mind. If Ethan Carter had truly entered Olivia Bennett's life by accident, then the situation was harmless. But if the relationship had been arranged to block his influence over the company, then he intended to uncover the truth, no matter how carefully it had been hidden. The tension inside Bennett Group headquarters grew quietly over the next several days. like a storm building behind a calm winter sky. Ethan Carter continued working with the engineering team, reviewing plans for a new freight terminal project near the Chicago River. His colleagues respected his knowledge, and several of them had already begun asking for his input during design meetings. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the steady rhythm of a normal professional life returning. Yet outside the engineering department, the whispers had grown louder. Rumors traveled quickly through corporate hallways, and Richard Callahan had begun asking more questions than anyone realized. One cold afternoon, Ethan was studying a digital model of a bridge support structure when Daniel Brooks appeared at the doorway of the engineering office. His usually calm expression carried a trace of urgency. "Mr. Carter, Miss Bennett would like to see you in her office immediately," he said quietly. Ethan looked up, immediately sensing something was wrong. He saved the design files and followed Daniel toward the executive elevator. Neither man spoke during the ride to the upper floor. When the doors opened, Ethan noticed several members of the communications department standing outside Olivia's office, speaking in low, worried voices. Inside the office, Olivia Bennett stood near the large window overlooking Lake Michigan, her arms folded tightly, as if holding herself steady. When Ethan entered the room, she turned toward him, and the concern in her eyes made his chest tighten. "What happened?" he asked. Olivia took a breath before answering. "Richard Callahan released a statement to several financial reporters this morning. He claims our relationship is a fabrication designed to manipulate the board and block his partnership proposal." Ethan frowned. "That man moves fast." Olivia nodded. "He hired investigators to look into your background. They discovered you were living in a pickup truck only a week before you arrived here." Ethan felt a quiet wave of embarrassment, but he kept his voice steady. "That part is true." Olivia stepped closer, frustration visible in her expression. "The problem is not your past, Ethan. The problem is the story he is telling about it. According to him, I recruited you as part of a stage performance to deceive investors." Ethan looked out the window for a moment. Below them, the frozen lake stretched into the distance like a sheet of pale glass. "If enough people believe him, that could damage your company," he said quietly. Olivia nodded slowly. "Exactly. Some of the board members are already demanding explanations." Ethan turned back toward her. "Then we tell them the truth." Olivia shook her head gently. "The truth is complicated. If they discover we agreed to pretend to be together, it will only confirm Callahan accusations." The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, Ethan spoke again with quiet determination. "Then maybe it is time I step away." Olivia stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" Ethan met her gaze calmly. "If I disappear from the situation, his argument loses power. He can no longer claim you are using me to manipulate the board." Olivia stepped closer, her voice suddenly sharper. "Ethan, that would only prove that he frightened you away." Ethan shook his head slowly. "I am not afraid of him, but I will not be the reason your company collapses." Olivia looked at him with a mixture of frustration and emotion that surprised them both. "You are not the reason any of this is happening," she said firmly. Ethan gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe not, but I might be the easiest way to end it." Outside the office, the winter wind swept across the surface of Lake Michigan, rattling faintly against the glass walls of the building. Ethan picked up the brown jacket from the chair beside the desk and folded it over his arm. Olivia watched him carefully, realizing what he was preparing to do. "You are leaving?" she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "Just long enough for the storm to pass." And with that simple decision, the fragile connection that had grown between them suddenly stood on the edge of breaking. Snow began falling again over Chicago the night Ethan Carter left Bennett Group headquarters. The wind carried thin white flakes across the dark streets as he walked alone through the industrial district near the river, the same place where his pickup truck waited behind the quiet warehouse. The city lights reflected faintly against the frozen pavement while traffic moved slowly along distant highways. Ethan pulled the worn brown jacket tighter around his shoulders as he reached the truck and opened the door. Inside the cab, the air was cold and still, just as it had been the night he gave the jacket away at the bus stop. For several minutes, he sat quietly with both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield while snow gathered slowly along the glass. He told himself that leaving had been the right decision. If Richard Callahan could no longer point to him as evidence of deception, then the accusations against Olivia Bennett would eventually lose their power. Yet the thought did not bring the sense of peace he expected. Instead, it left a quiet emptiness that felt strangely heavier than the freezing air. Miles away, in the upper floors of Bennett Group headquarters, Olivia Bennett stood in the same office where their strange agreement had first begun. The lights of the city glittered across the dark water of Lake Michigan while reporters gathered in the lobby below the building. News about Richard Callahan accusations had spread quickly through financial media. Daniel Brooks entered the office holding a tablet that displayed the latest headlines. Miss Bennett, several board members are demanding a public response before the charity gala tomorrow evening, he said carefully. Olivia nodded slowly without looking away from the window. The gala had been planned months earlier as a fundraising event for community housing projects across Illinois. Now it had become the center of attention for an entirely different reason. Daniel studied her expression for a moment. May I ask if Mr. Carter contacted you after leaving earlier today? Olivia shook her head gently. No. And that is exactly why I need to speak before anyone else does. Daniel understood immediately. You intend to address the accusations publicly at the gala. Olivia turned toward him with quiet determination in her eyes. Yes. If people believe I created a lie, then I will tell them the truth. The next evening, the grand ballroom of the Chicago Cultural Center filled with investors, journalists, and city leaders gathered for the charity event. Cameras flashed as guests arrived beneath the tall arched ceilings decorated with warm golden lights. Richard Callahan stood near the front of the room, speaking confidently with several reporters. The story of a fabricated relationship had already become a subject of curiosity across the city financial networks. When Olivia Bennett finally stepped onto the stage at the center of the ballroom, the conversations slowly faded into silence. She wore a simple dark dress and stood alone beneath the bright lights while dozens of cameras pointed toward her. Thank you all for coming tonight, she began calmly. This event was originally organized to support new housing for families across our state. But I understand many of you are here because of a different story circulating in the news. The audience remained completely silent as she continued. Earlier this week, I told several members of my company board that I was in a serious relationship. That statement was made during a moment of pressure, and it created confusion that I take full responsibility for. Some reporters began whispering quietly, while cameras continued recording every word. Olivia lifted her eyes toward the audience and spoke with clear honesty. The truth is that the man many of you have heard about did enter my life during the winter storm last week. But not because of any corporate strategy. He entered my life because he gave away the only warm jacket he owned to help a stranger standing in the cold. A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Olivia continued, speaking with emotion that no one in the room had expected from the usually composed chief executive officer. That man is Ethan Carter. And the kindness he showed me on that night was more honest than anything money or power could ever buy. As the audience absorbed her words, Olivia looked toward the back doors of the ballroom without knowing whether the person she hoped to see would walk through them. Because in that moment, the entire future of both their lives seemed to depend on a single unanswered question. Would Ethan Carter return? For a moment after Olivia Bennett finished speaking, the ballroom remained completely silent. The golden lights above reflected across hundreds of faces while reporters lowered their cameras slightly, uncertain what would happen next. At the back of the room, the large wooden doors slowly opened. A gust of cold winter air slipped into the ballroom as a familiar figure stepped inside. Ethan Carter stood there wearing the same worn brown jacket that had begun the entire story. Snow still clung faintly to the shoulders of the coat, as if the storm outside had followed him into the building. Several people turned toward the doorway, and a quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Olivia saw him immediately. The tension in her chest loosened in a single breath as Ethan walked forward through the rows of guests. Every step across the polished floor felt heavier than the last, but his eyes never left hers. When he reached the front of the ballroom, he stopped beside the stage and looked up at her with a calm, steady expression. I guess I showed up. A little late, he said quietly, his voice carrying through the silent room. A few people in the audience smiled softly, while others watched with growing curiosity. Olivia stepped down from the stage until she stood directly in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan turned slightly so that the audience could hear him clearly. A week ago during the snowstorm, I saw a woman standing alone at a bus stop, and I gave her my jacket because she looked like she needed it more than I did. He paused and glanced around the ballroom. I did not know her name at the time, and I definitely did not know she was one of the most powerful business leaders in the city. The crowd listened closely as Ethan continued. Later, she asked me to help her with a complicated situation involving her company and her investors. At first, our relationship was supposed to be an arrangement, a temporary solution. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Ethan turned back toward Olivia, and his voice softened slightly. I realized the woman who runs one of the largest companies in this city is also the same person who stayed up half the night helping me review bridge designs because she believed in my work. She is the same person who called an engineering director and insisted that a man who had lost everything deserved another chance to rebuild his life. A warm ripple of emotion moved through the audience as Ethan reached into the pocket of his jacket. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet honesty that no one in the room could mistake. The truth is that our relationship did start as an arrangement. But what I feel for Olivia Bennett now is completely real. He held up a small silver ring that reflected the ballroom lights. It was the same ring he had carried in the small metal box inside his truck for many months, waiting for the moment his life might finally begin again. Olivia looked at the ring, and her eyes filled with sudden emotion. Ethan stepped closer and spoke the final words slowly so that every person in the room could hear them clearly. Olivia Bennett, you once asked me to pretend to be your boyfriend. I would rather spend the rest of my life being your partner for real. The room erupted into applause as Olivia laughed softly through her tears and nodded without hesitation. Yes, she answered simply. 1 year later, the lobby of Bennett Group headquarters displayed a framed photograph near the entrance. Beneath the image was a small plaque that read, "One kindness can change everything." The photograph showed a man and a woman standing together in the snow beside a bus stop, sharing a worn brown jacket and smiling as if the cold no longer mattered at all.